You think African American breakfasts were just grits and eggs? Think again. Black kitchens started mornings with dishes so hearty they powered families through long days of work. Let's dig into 60 African American breakfasts from the 1960s and 70s that have disappeared. Leftover sweet potato pie filling spread on toast became Thanksgiving morning sweetness that used every bit of holiday preparation. When grandmothers made sweet potato pies for dinner, extra filling often remained in the mixing bowl. Rather than waste it, the spiced sweet potato mixture was spread thick on toasted bread, creating breakfast that tasted like dessert. The filling contained eggs, milk, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, making it nutritious as well as delicious. Children loved this unexpected treat, feeling like they were getting away with eating pie for breakfast. Adults enjoyed the creative repurposing, appreciating how nothing was wasted. The sweet potatoes provided vitamins and fiber while the toast offered substance and texture. This breakfast cost nothing extra since it used ingredients already prepared for the day's feast. Leftover sweet potato pie filling on toast represented the ultimate waste-not wisdom, showing how grandmothers viewed every ingredient as precious. Stewed apples over grits was the quiet morning comfort many families turned to when fresh fruit was limited, but preserved apples were always within reach. Grandparents would slice apples thin and let them simmer with sugar or syrup until they softened into a fragrant golden mixture that tasted like fall in every season. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thickening slowly as it absorbed the heat. When the stewed apples were spooned over the top, the contrast of creamy grits and sweet fruit felt like a small luxury. It was warm, filling, and gentle, the kind of breakfast that soothed the stomach and the spirit. Some families added cinnamon, others added butter, but most kept it simple because the apples were already sweet enough. This dish was a reminder of home orchards, backyard trees, and jars of preserves lined up on pantry shelves. It tasted like patience and tradition, like the kind of mornings where time moved slower. Even today, stewed apples over grits feels like a forgotten treasure from a quieter time. Homemade buttermilk pancakes were a weekend ritual that stretched across generations. Before box mixes, families mixed their own batter: flour, eggs, buttermilk, and a pinch of soda for lift. The griddle hissed as each ladleful hit the heat, bubbling and browning into golden perfection. They came off in stacks, soft in the center, crisp at the edges, ready for butter and syrup or sometimes just sugar sprinkled on top. Buttermilk gave them their signature tang, the secret that made them taste like home. Mothers and grandmothers flipped them by instinct, never measuring, always knowing by sight when they were done. These pancakes were meant to be shared, piled high in the middle of the table for everyone to grab. They were a reminder that joy could come cheap, that breakfast could be a celebration all on its own. In a world before hurry, this was how mornings were meant to feel. Fried bologna on white bread was one of the most common breakfasts for working families during the civil rights era. Bologna was affordable, and frying it in a skillet brought out flavor and made it feel more substantial. Layered on soft white bread with mustard or hot sauce, it became a sandwich that was cheap, quick, and filling. For children, it was often packed as lunch, but for adults, it was breakfast before long shifts in fields, factories, or offices. The salty, savory taste was familiar and comforting, even if it came from one of the cheapest meats available. Fried bologna sandwiches symbolized both thrift and practicality, reflecting the reality of what many households relied on to get by. They were humble, but they carried enough strength to power people through demanding days. This dish became part of the memory of struggle and perseverance, a reminder that even inexpensive food could play a role in fueling determination and resilience. Red-eye gravy and biscuits gave breakfast a bold, bitter soul. Born from ham drippings and black coffee, it was thin, smoky, and sharp enough to wake you faster than any alarm. Grandparents poured the hot coffee into the greasy skillet, scraping the bottom to gather every bit of flavor. The smell hit first, strong, dark, and unmistakable. Fresh biscuits soaked it up like sponges, turning bitter into savory beauty. It was a meal for workers, for those who rose before dawn and needed fire in their bellies. Red-eye gravy did not pretend to be sweet or gentle. It was honest, intense, and unforgettable. Grandparents said it was a grown folks breakfast, the kind that taught you to face the day head-on. The flavor was bold, a mix of smoke and bitterness that tasted like life itself, hard, sharp, but satisfying. Every bite carried stories of mornings spent in fields or factories, hands rough but hearts steady. It was more than a meal. It was morning courage in liquid form. Red-eye ham and coffee gravy provided a bold, bracing start to the morning with a flavor that lingered long after breakfast was done. Thick slices of country-cured ham were seared in a heavy skillet until their edges browned and their fat rendered into a savory base. Into that sizzling pan went black coffee, which deglazed the salty bits and created a thin, smoky gravy. The sharp bitterness of coffee balanced the ham's rich saltiness, producing a sauce both surprising and addictive. Poured over warm biscuits or spooned onto grits, the gravy soaked in and carried a gentle caffeine kick that woke up the senses. Families across the South prized this dish for its simplicity and strength, a reminder of farm mornings when nothing went to waste. Red-eye ham and coffee gravy reflected the ingenuity of African-American cooks who transformed pantry basics into something unforgettable, a breakfast that spoke of resilience and tradition with every deep, savory bite. Fried fish and grits made weekends feel like a holiday, even when money was short. The fish came from local rivers, catfish, perch, or whiting, caught with care and cleaned at dawn. Grandparents seasoned the fillets with salt, pepper, and cornmeal before dropping them into hot grease. The sizzle filled the air, mingling with laughter and the bubbling sound of grits cooking nearby. Those grits, thick and creamy, waited patiently for the fish to finish. When both came together on the plate, it was magic. Crispy, tender fish resting beside buttery grits that tasted like the earth itself. Sometimes hot sauce joined the mix, or a slice of white bread to catch every crumb. It was a meal of pride and purpose, proof that even poverty could hold celebration. The river provided the food, the kitchen turned it into love. Fried fish and grits were a reminder that wealth wasn't always counted in dollars. It was measured in moments shared around a steaming plate. Rolled oats with sorghum drizzle were one of the more nourishing breakfasts that families turned to during lean years. Oats were cheap, filling, and easy to cook, while sorghum syrup replaced sugar as a natural sweetener. Together, they made a bowl that was hearty, sustaining, and connected to the land. Adults leaned on it to fuel long workdays, and children were sent off to school with the strength it provided. The flavor was earthy and slightly bittersweet, carrying the essence of thrift and self-reliance. Families valued it because it stretched far and could be flavored with seasonal fruit if available. Rolled oats with sorghum drizzle represented more than practicality. It symbolized survival, tied to agricultural tradition. It was a dish that reflected both health and heritage, remembered for its role in sustaining households during the civil rights era. It proved that nourishment could come from the humblest combinations, carrying families through mornings that demanded resilience and determination. Fried potatoes and onions, or home fries as many called them, were the true breakfast of yesterday's leftovers. Cold potatoes from dinner were sliced thin and tossed in a skillet with sizzling butter or lard. Onions followed, their sweetness blooming as they browned. The two cooked together until the edges crisped and the smell filled the kitchen with comfort. Salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika. That was all they needed. Each forkful was smoky and soft, full of the flavor that only time and care could give. It was food for early risers and late sleepers alike, eaten from chipped plates at wooden tables. Home fries were the definition of resourcefulness. Nothing wasted. Everything transformed. Served with eggs or just on their own, they carried the quiet satisfaction of a meal made from yesterday's effort. In the hum of the morning, that skillet was both memory and promise. Scrapple slices were one of the most resourceful breakfasts older generations relied on, especially in regions where nothing from the pig went to waste. Scrapple mixed pork scraps with cornmeal and spices forming a loaf that could be sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft on the inside. Grandparents cooked it in a hot skillet, letting each piece form that perfect golden crust that crackled slightly under the fork. It was savory, hearty, and deeply rooted in tradition, a dish born from the idea that every ingredient had value. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or mustard, but no matter how it was served, scrapple had a distinctive flavor that stayed with you. It tasted like farm mornings, like smoke rising from cast iron pans, like a time when food came from skill rather than convenience. Children might turn up their noses at the idea today, but to those who grew up on it, scrapple was a breakfast that meant strength, thrift, and the comfort of knowing a meal would always be there. Even now, the memory of that sizzling sound brings people back to early mornings in small kitchens where tradition guided the skillet. Leftover greens mixed with scrambled eggs created Thanksgiving morning plates combining vegetables with protein economically. Collard greens or turnip greens from earlier cooking were chopped and stirred directly into beaten eggs, creating green-flecked scrambles. The greens added earthiness and nutrition while the eggs provided richness. This breakfast cost nothing extra since it used greens already cooked. Grandmothers understood that combining leftovers with fresh eggs made both components more interesting. The Potlikker from the greens seasoned the eggs naturally. Children might have resisted plain leftover greens but accepted them willingly when mixed with eggs. Adults appreciated the nutritional wisdom of combining vegetables with protein. Leftover greens with scrambled eggs proved that creative combinations could make yesterday's food feel new and intentional. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were a sweet and savory breakfast that carried the flavor of Southern tradition. Grandparents often made sausage from scratch or bought it fresh, shaping it into patties with practiced hands. The patties sizzled in the skillet, filling the house with a smell that meant the day was off to a strong start. Once cooked, they were served alongside cane syrup, thick and dark, ready for dipping or drizzling. The combination of salty sausage and sweet syrup created a harmony that felt indulgent even when the ingredients were simple. It stuck to your ribs, kept you full, and tasted like a morning wrapped in warmth. Cane syrup was cheaper and easier to find than maple syrup, but it had a bold flavor all its own. Families passed down the preference across generations, pairing it with biscuits, sausage, and sometimes even eggs. Country sausage patties with cane syrup were more than breakfast. They were the memory of Sunday mornings, crowded tables, and laughter rising like steam from the skillet. Homemade donuts were a labor of love long before convenience ever came in a box. Families mixed flour, eggs, milk, and a little sugar by hand, rolling the dough on floured tables before cutting perfect rings. The oil had to be just right, hot enough to bubble but not burn, and the kitchen filled with the smell of sweetness meeting heat. Each donut puffed up golden and soft, kissed with crispness at the edges. Once drained, they were rolled in sugar or dipped in glaze, still warm and tender. Children waited eagerly, dusting their fingers in sugar while stealing the first taste. These weren't store-bought treats. They were handmade rewards, crafted slowly on quiet mornings. A batch of donuts meant love, celebration, or simply the joy of having enough ingredients to spare. They were simple yet sacred, proof that happiness could be fried and shared. Some cooks made holes into tiny donut balls, frying them as munchkins before the name ever existed. Others flavored the dough with nutmeg or a splash of buttermilk for tang. The smell of homemade donuts lingered like a song through the house, reminding everyone that effort and sweetness often went hand in hand. Scalded cornmeal porridge was one of the simplest breakfasts, but it was dependable and nourishing in every season. Cornmeal was whisked into boiling water, then enriched with a splash of milk if available, turning into a smooth, hot cereal. It was plain but filling, eaten with a little molasses, sugar, or even just salt depending on what a family had. Children grew up with bowls of it before heading to school, and adults leaned on it for early morning labor. The dish carried an earthy flavor that became familiar, tied to the smell of steaming pots in family kitchens. It was cheap to prepare and stretched far, making it a perfect meal during lean years. Scalded cornmeal porridge was proof that even the most basic ingredients could sustain life when nothing else was available. It became one of those dishes remembered with both fondness and respect, a reminder of perseverance and the strength found in simple foods. Crackling bread was the sound and taste of tradition. Grandparents saved every pork scrap from butchering, frying them down until crisp. Those cracklings, salty and rich, were folded into cornbread batter that sizzled when it hit the skillet. The smell was deep, smoky, and warm, like comfort made edible. When it came out of the oven, the bread was golden brown, with crunchy bites hidden in every corner. It was heavy but satisfying, each piece holding the spirit of thrift and endurance. Families gathered around to eat it hot, breaking it apart with their hands. It was the kind of food that stretched a meal, that turned a handful of cornmeal and scraps into something filling and proud. Crackling bread was heritage baked into every crumb, a reminder that even the hardest times could taste good when shared together. The sound of the crust cracking filled the kitchen, mingling with laughter and the hum of stories passed down through generations. Every bite carried the memory of hard work, of families who found a way to turn survival into celebration. Served with greens or beans, it stood as proof that nothing from the land was wasted. In that bread lived history, care, and the soul of a people who made every meal mean something. Fried apples with brown sugar filled kitchens with the scent of caramel and spice as butter sizzled in heavy skillets across African-American homes of the 1970s. Thick apple slices were laid into the pan where they softened and browned, soaking up melted butter and a slow sprinkle of dark brown sugar. The sugar melted into a glossy syrup that coated every piece, creating a warm and fragrant side that paired perfectly with hot bread or flaky biscuits. Some cooks added a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg, while others squeezed in a little lemon juice to brighten the sweetness. Families loved these fried apples as a weekend treat, serving them alongside sausage, grits, or even spooned over pancakes for an indulgent start to the morning. The dish honored a tradition of turning simple farm fruit into something special without wasting a single ingredient. Fried apples with brown sugar captured the heart of home-style cooking, transforming an everyday apple into a rich and memorable breakfast delight. Oatmeal with evaporated milk made plain oats taste like luxury. Grandparents boiled the oats slow, stirring with patience until thick and creamy. A splash of evaporated milk turned it rich, giving it sweetness and body even without sugar. Sometimes a little butter melted in, swirling gold into gray. The smell was gentle, warm, milky, and kind. It filled hungry bellies and comforted tired hearts, especially on cold mornings when heat was scarce. The milk, thick and silky from the can, gave the oatmeal a flavor that felt indulgent in a time when little else was. Kids didn't always know it was a cheaper meal. They just knew it tasted good. For families who had to stretch every dollar, oatmeal with evaporated milk was proof that care mattered more than cost. Each spoonful was slow and satisfying, carrying love in every bite. It was breakfast made to last, and to remind you that small comforts could still feel grand. Cornmeal donuts were one of the rare indulgences families created when they wanted sweetness but had little to spend. Made from cornmeal mixed with flour, eggs if available, and sweetened with a touch of sugar or molasses, the dough was shaped into rounds and fried in lard until golden. Dusted with sugar, they became a treat that brought children running to the table. Unlike bakery donuts, these were dense, filling, and rustic, but they carried a charm that came from being homemade. Families turned to them especially on weekends or special mornings when a little extra joy was needed to break the monotony of hardship. Cornmeal donuts were proof that celebration could exist even in times of scarcity, transforming everyday ingredients into something special. They were portable too, often tucked into lunch pails for later in the day. Cornmeal donuts may not have been fancy, but they were treasured, carrying both sweetness and comfort into mornings that demanded resilience. Peach preserves on hot biscuits was sunshine captured in a jar. Ripe peaches cooked down with sugar until golden and thick, the scent filling the kitchen like summer itself. Spread onto a steaming biscuit straight from the oven, the preserves melted into the crumb, seeping sweetness into every bite. It was sticky, messy, and utterly perfect. Grandmothers kept shelves lined with jars, each one a memory of fruit picked by hand and simmered slow. Those preserves were more than food. They were love saved for later, waiting for a cold morning to brighten. A biscuit topped with peach preserves was more than breakfast. It was a reminder that summer could be tasted even in the heart of winter. Families gathered around the table as the golden syrup dripped from fingers and laughter filled the air. Some added a pat of butter before spreading the preserves, letting the heat make everything glossy and rich. Every jar represented care, the patience to peel, stir, and seal by hand. The first taste always brought back long afternoons of harvest, of baskets heavy with peaches and sunlight. Peach preserves on biscuits were a bridge between seasons, a bite of warmth that carried through the year. Butter-fried cornbread slices were the kind of breakfast that made you sit up a little straighter just from the smell alone. Leftover cornbread never went to waste, especially not when a skillet and a bit of butter could transform it into something golden, crisp, and wonderfully indulgent. Grandparents sliced the cornbread thick, letting the butter melt across the hot pan before laying each piece down to brown. The edges crisped quickly, creating a contrast to the soft center that felt almost like cake without the sweetness. Some families ate it plain, others added syrup or honey, and some sprinkled sugar over the top, but every version tasted rich and deeply satisfying. This was breakfast that reminded you of cast-iron skillets, warm kitchens, and mornings that started long before the sun rose high. Butter-fried cornbread slices were a way to stretch yesterday's food into today's comfort. Fried cabbage with fatback was Thanksgiving morning vegetables that provided fiber and vitamins alongside rich pork flavor. Fresh cabbage was shredded and cooked slowly in cast-iron skillets with sliced fatback until the cabbage wilted and absorbed the pork's smoky richness. The fatback rendered its fat, coating every strand of cabbage with savory goodness. This breakfast was economical because cabbage was cheap and plentiful during fall, while fatback provided flavoring from preserved pork. Grandmothers cooked this when resources were tight but nutrition was still needed. The cabbage softened but retained slight texture, creating comfort without being mushy. Children sometimes resisted vegetables at breakfast but ate this willingly because of the bacon-like flavor. Adults valued how the dish provided greens without feeling like health food. Fried cabbage with fatback represented the wisdom of making vegetables appealing through fat and flavor. Banana bread pudding cups were one of the most clever ways grandparents reused stale bread, turning dryness into softness and waste into warmth. They mashed ripe bananas into the bread with milk, sugar, and a bit of spice if it was available, folding everything together until the mixture became thick and custard-like, scooped into small baking dishes or muffin tins. The cups baked into soft, fragrant servings that filled the entire kitchen with the smell of banana and browned bread. It was breakfast that tasted like dessert, but no one ever complained. The bananas added sweetness and moisture, stretching the ingredients into something filling and gentle on the stomach. Grandparents made these cups because they could not bear to throw out bread and because they knew how to turn limitations into something delicious. Children loved the warm centers and the slightly crisp tops, not realizing the whole breakfast was built from leftovers. Banana bread pudding cups were a quiet victory in the kitchen, a reminder that thrift could still bring joy. Grapefruit with sugar and a broiled topping was the picture of mid-century sophistication, elegant yet born of practicality. Halved grapefruit was sprinkled with sugar and broiled just long enough for the top to bubble and brown, creating a caramelized glaze that softened the tartness beneath. Served in its own rind with a little spoon, it looked like something from a hotel breakfast tray. Housewives loved it because it felt fancy but cost almost nothing. The heat mellowed the fruit, making it warm and fragrant, the sugar turning into a crisp, golden shell. It was light, refreshing, and surprisingly indulgent for something so simple. For a generation discovering convenience and presentation, this dish was breakfast theater. Grapefruit with sugar was more than fruit. It was optimism, the taste of a new kind of morning when simplicity could still feel special. Some families added a drizzle of honey or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra warmth, while others topped it with a cherry for flair. It became a symbol of modern homemaking, polished, easy, and delightful to the eye. The broiled grapefruit was as much about beauty as flavor, proof that even the simplest fruit could feel luxurious when given a moment of care. Cabbage and egg scramble was one of those quick, no-fuss breakfasts that households relied on when the pantry was light. Leftover cabbage, chopped fine, was sautéed in fat before being stirred into scrambled eggs, turning two basic foods into a sustaining dish. The cabbage stretched the eggs further, allowing larger families to fill plates without needing a dozen. It was hearty, yet inexpensive, providing vitamins and protein in a simple skillet meal. Farm families especially leaned on it, as cabbage was easy to grow and kept well into the colder months. The dish carried a humble flavor, but with hot sauce or pepper sprinkled on top, it was comforting and memorable. Children may not have loved cabbage, but when folded into eggs, it became tolerable and even enjoyable. For adults, it was practical, quick to make before long days of work, and efficient in using every bit of food available. Cabbage and egg scramble was modest, but it was deeply tied to survival and resilience in daily life. Cabbage and onions with cornbread made a humble breakfast that filled both the belly and the heart. When meat was scarce, the skillet became a garden feast. Grandparents chopped cabbage fresh from the yard or the market, tossing it with sliced onions and a bit of lard or grease. The smell that rose from the pan was earthy and warm, like hope frying slow. As it cooked down, the cabbage softened and the onions turned sweet, making a broth rich enough to dip bread into. Cornbread baked in the oven beside it, crusty on top and tender inside. The two came together on the plate, steam rising in quiet grace. It was not fancy, but it was full of care. The kind of meal that kept families going through hard seasons, reminding them that flavor did not come from plenty. It came from patience. Every bite spoke of the land, of effort, and of faith in simple things. The cornbread soaked up the juices, catching every drop like a blessing. In those moments, a table without meat still felt abundant, and no one left hungry. Creole shrimp omelet brought the rich flavors of the Gulf Coast to morning tables, folding tender shrimp and fresh scallions into fluffy eggs seasoned with paprika and a touch of cayenne. Shrimp were quickly sautéed with butter and garlic until just pink, then combined with beaten eggs and poured into a hot skillet. As the omelet puffed, the seafood infused the eggs with a briny sweetness that spoke of Louisiana waters. Some cooks added diced bell peppers or a spoonful of tomato sauce for extra color and depth, while others finished with a squeeze of lemon. This breakfast balanced elegance and everyday comfort, reflecting African-American culinary ties to coastal Creole traditions. Families savored the dish on special weekends or when fresh shrimp were plentiful, making breakfast feel like a celebration. The Creole shrimp omelet captured the spirit of New Orleans and the surrounding Gulf, proving that a simple egg dish could deliver vibrant flavor and a taste of Southern heritage before the day began. Cornmeal pancakes were the breakfast that never failed to satisfy. When flour ran low, grandparents reached for cornmeal, mixing it with water, a pinch of salt, and whatever fat they had saved. The batter was thick and hearty, poured into a skillet greased with bacon drippings or lard. Each pancake came out golden and crisp at the edges, with a dense, warm center that held the taste of home. Syrup, molasses, or even a sprinkle of sugar made them sweet, but they were just as good plain. The smell of frying cornmeal filled the house, comforting and familiar, the sound of a day beginning right. Kids gathered around the table, forks ready, while grandparents flipped each one with practiced rhythm. Cornmeal pancakes were more than breakfast. They were survival turned soft and golden. In every bite was a story of making do, of turning simple things into something you could be proud to serve. Molasses cornmeal custard was a dish that offered sweetness and substance while depending only on pantry staples. Families baked it by whisking cornmeal, milk, eggs when available, and molasses into a smooth mixture that thickened into a soft pudding in the oven. It was inexpensive to prepare, but filling enough to feed a household, making it a beloved breakfast or after-supper treat. The flavor was earthy and rich, with the deep sweetness of molasses carrying through each bite. Children often looked forward to it as a rare indulgence in households where desserts were not common. Adults valued it for its practicality, since it used cheap ingredients that could stretch for days. Molasses cornmeal custard represented thrift, but it also carried warmth and a sense of care, showing how families turned necessities into moments of comfort. It became part of the memory of kitchens during times of struggle, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. Cornmeal mush with maple syrup was proof that humble food could still feel like luxury. The cornmeal simmered low and slow until thick, its subtle sweetness waiting beneath the surface. Poured into bowls, it became creamy comfort. Chilled overnight and fried, it became something new. Either way, a drizzle of maple syrup transformed it completely, golden, fragrant, and warm. It was the taste of patience rewarded, of kitchens that made the most out of little. Grandparents ate it without complaint. Children learned to love it without realizing it was born from necessity. The syrup soaked into every bite, blending with the corn's earthiness until it became something deeply satisfying. In hard times, it was survival. In better ones, it was nostalgia. Cornmeal mush reminded families that gratitude could be sweet, especially when poured warm from a jug and shared around the table. Some cooks stirred in butter or milk to make it richer, while others poured it into loaf pans and sliced it for frying the next day. It was a dish that shifted effortlessly between breakfast and supper, proof that versatility was the heart of thrift. The sound of it frying in a skillet, the scent of corn and syrup mingling in the air, it all spoke of comfort. Cornmeal mush was a quiet triumph, a reminder that even the plainest ingredients could carry grace. Canned mackerel with eggs was one of those breakfasts that filled the house with a smell you never forgot, bold and rich, the kind of scent that told you someone was cooking with purpose. Grandparents used canned mackerel because it was inexpensive, packed with protein, and always waiting in the pantry when fresh meat was not an option. They would open the can, drain the fish, and flake it into a skillet with onions or peppers if they had them. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the fish and stirred until everything blended into a savory scramble that tasted far more filling than it looked. It was a hard-working breakfast, meant to fuel long days, and it carried a flavor that felt deeply tied to the kitchens of older generations. Children growing up on it did not always understand how thrifty it was, only that it tasted warm, smoky, and strangely comforting. First thing in the morning, the mackerel gave the dish a richness, the eggs softened it, and together they made something cheap but unforgettable. Even today, people who grew up with canned mackerel and eggs describe it as a meal that tasted like family resourcefulness at its finest. It was a reminder that nourishing food did not need to be fancy to be good. Sliced tomatoes with salt and pepper on buttered toast became Thanksgiving morning freshness that brightened heavy breakfast plates with simple elegance and thoughtful care. Ripe tomatoes from late harvest or final market purchases were sliced thick and layered carefully on buttered toast, then seasoned simply with coarse salt and freshly ground black pepper that enhanced natural flavor. The tomatoes' juice soaked into the bread, while the butter added richness that balanced the acidity perfectly, creating harmony on the plate. This breakfast provided vitamins and moisture, balancing richer dishes like sausage and eggs that otherwise dominated morning tables with their heaviness. Grandmothers included it when they wanted something light and refreshing before the heavy dinner that would come later in the day. Children might have preferred sweeter options initially, but learned to appreciate fresh vegetables as proper breakfast food worth enjoying. How cakes with butter and sugar were the sweet breakfast treat that felt almost like dessert, even though they came from the simplest ingredients in the pantry. Made from cornmeal batter poured onto a hot skillet, each cake sizzled as it spread, forming a crisp edge and soft center that tasted perfect every single time grandparents would flip them with practiced ease, stacking them high and spreading butter that melted instantly into the warm surface. A sprinkle of sugar added just enough sweetness to make the hoe cakes feel like a special morning indulgence. They were quick, affordable, and comforting. The kind of food that made children sit down fast and quiet at the table. Hoe cakes were history and home all at once, a dish born from necessity that became a beloved tradition. Even now, the memory of that buttery sweetness lingers in the minds of anyone lucky enough to grow up with them. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was the quiet comfort of a cold morning, a dish that asked for nothing but gave everything. Rolled oats simmered slowly until soft, the steam fogging up windows and waking up sleepy kitchens. A spoonful of brown sugar swirled into the bowl, melting into ribbons of sweetness. Then came a splash of cream, turning it all silky and rich. It was breakfast that stayed with you, not just in the stomach, but in the heart. For children, it meant warmth before a long walk to school. For adults, it meant strength to face a long day. Oatmeal was a small act of love, steady and reliable, a simple way of saying, "You matter." Grandparents knew that food like this built more than bodies, it built belonging. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was proof that kindness could be served in a bowl. Onion and potato hash cakes were one of those breakfasts that always felt hearty, even without meat. Potatoes and onions were grated, mixed with flour or cornmeal, and fried into crisp patties that could be eaten plain or with hot sauce if available. The dish was cheap, easy to prepare, and could stretch across several plates, making it ideal for large households. It was often made in the early mornings before children headed to school or adults to long shifts at work. The taste was simple but filling, a combination of flavors that became closely tied to daily life in tough years. Families leaned on it not only for its thrift, but for the comfort it gave in the face of uncertainty. Onion and potato hash cakes fueled countless mornings of determination, carrying people through struggles outside the kitchen. They became a dish remembered not just for their flavor, but for their role in sustaining courage and community. Homemade biscuits with cane syrup were a breakfast of pride, born from hands that worked and loved without rest. Grandparents woke early, sifting flour, cutting in lard, and rolling out dough on wooden tables dusted with years of memory. The smell of baking filled the house, the warmth spilling into every room. When the biscuits came out, golden and steaming, the cane syrup waited nearby, thick and dark as molasses. It poured slow, catching the morning light like honey turned to amber. The sweetness mixed with the salt of the biscuit, creating comfort too deep to describe. It was the kind of meal that made you pause before the first bite, because it tasted like home. Every batch told a story, of mothers who made do, of children who grew up strong on simplicity. There was joy in its repetition, in the rhythm of making something real from so little. The meal said, "We might not have much, but we have each other." And that was enough. The sound of the oven door closing, the clink of a butter knife, the hush that followed the first bite, all of it became part of the morning ritual. That biscuit, soft on the inside and crisp at the edge, carried warmth that lasted long after breakfast ended. It was the taste of love baked daily, patient and proud. Hot water cornbread patties delivered the satisfying crunch of cast iron frying to countless Delta kitchens, where cornmeal was as common as morning sun. Cooks stirred hot water into fine cornmeal until the mixture held together, then shaped it by hand and slid it into shimmering oil. The patties sizzled and crisped, forming a browned crust that gave way to a tender interior. The method required no milk or eggs, only the steady skill of a practiced hand, making it accessible and quick. Families ate these cornbread rounds with eggs, greens, or a simple drizzle of honey when sugar was scarce. In many homes, the sound of batter hitting hot oil signaled breakfast was ready, filling the air with the nutty aroma of toasting corn. Hot water cornbread patties celebrated resourcefulness and flavor, reminding everyone that the best dishes often came from the simplest combinations of grain, heat, and love, passed down through generations of African American cooks. Biscuits with sorghum syrup and butter were Thanksgiving morning luxury made affordable through grandmother's baking skills and pantry staples. The biscuits were made from scratch using flour, lard, buttermilk, and baking powder, rolled out and cut with drinking glasses before being baked until golden. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than maple and more flavorful than corn syrup, was drizzled generously over split biscuits slathered with butter. The combination created flavors that felt indulgent, though the cost was minimal. Black families treasured sorghum because it connected them to Southern farming traditions and provided sweetness during hard times. Grandmothers kept large tins of sorghum in pantries, knowing it would last months. Thanksgiving morning biscuits were made fresh, still warm when served. Children ate them eagerly, syrup dripping down their chins. Adults savored them slowly, appreciating the craftsmanship required for perfect biscuits. We never realized mattered? Fried cornmeal mush with syrup was one of those breakfasts that quietly carried families through the hardest decades, long before boxed cereal took over the mornings. A pot of mush would be cooked and thickened the night before because nothing could go to waste, and cornmeal was one of the cheapest staples you could rely on. By sunrise, it would be firm enough to slice, each piece hitting the skillet with that gentle hiss that meant breakfast was truly beginning. The outside browned until crisp, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and steady, making every bite feel both hearty and familiar. When syrup was poured over those golden slices, it turned the humble dish into something sweet and comforting, the kind of sweetness that did not need to be fancy to feel special. Grandparents made this because it filled bellies, stretched ingredients, and tasted like something far richer than it really was. Children did not think about thrift or struggle, they just knew it tasted like love served on a plate. Fried mush might look simple today, but its roots run deep in memory, in resilience, in the way older generations held families together one skillet breakfast at a time. Even now, one bite brings back chilly mornings, warm kitchens, and the soft scrape of a metal spatula flipping a slice just right. Fried bologna sandwiches were born from necessity, but remembered for love. Thick slices of bologna hit a hot skillet and curled at the edges, sizzling in their own fat until browned and crisp. A fried egg or a slice of cheese might join the sandwich if luck allowed, but even plain, it was perfection. Served between two pieces of soft white bread or a biscuit, it was salty, savory, and satisfying. This was the kind of breakfast that did not apologize for being simple. It was fuel for long days, a way to stretch a few cents into something hearty. Children carried them in brown paper bags, while adults grabbed one before heading out to work. The smell of frying bologna filled the house, and even the neighbors could tell breakfast was ready. It was a reminder that good food did not have to be fancy. It only had to be made with care. For many families, this humble sandwich was a badge of resilience, the proof that they could make something delicious out of whatever they had. Cold cornbread and milk was often called the poor man's cereal, but it was more than a label. It was a lifeline. Day-old cornbread, often too dry to eat on its own, was crumbled into bowls and covered with milk or buttermilk, creating a filling meal that could be eaten quickly before school or work. For children, it was breakfast. For adults, it was sometimes supper, proving its versatility. It carried a tangy, comforting flavor that became familiar in many Southern households. What made it special was not the taste alone, but the reminder that nothing was wasted, not even stale bread. In communities with little to spare, this dish represented survival and practicality. Cold cornbread and milk was part of the rhythm of daily life, a dish that carried generations through hard times and into mornings of determination. Even with its simplicity, it gave people what they needed to keep going during days that demanded courage and endurance. Fatback and grits was breakfast built on thrift and grit. The fatback sizzled in the skillet first, releasing its salty aroma as it browned and curled. The grease left behind became gold, seasoning the pot of bubbling grits to perfection. Stirred smooth, thick, and rich, the grits soaked up that savory flavor like a secret only the poor could afford to know. Grandparents served it in bowls, steaming and simple, with crispy bits of fatback on top. It was heavy in the best way, fuel for a long day of labor. There was pride in every bite, the kind of pride that came from making much out of little. Fatback and grits was not just breakfast. It was strength served with a spoon, a Southern hymn sung over a hot stove. Sometimes a pat of margarine was dropped on top to melt into the heat, adding a layer of richness that made the bowl glisten. The meal was eaten slow, savoring every spoonful before the workday began. Grandparents said it was food that stuck to your ribs, and they were right. It kept you going long after sunrise. It tasted like memory and perseverance, like something deeper than hunger itself. Sorghum syrup. Waffles filled kitchens with the warm scent of toasted grain and caramel sweetness, creating a breakfast that tasted like a weekend celebration. Batter made with fresh eggs and rich milk cooked in cast-iron waffle irons until crisp and golden, ready to catch every drop of thick sorghum syrup. This dark, earthy sweetener offered a depth of flavor beyond ordinary maple, with notes of molasses and a hint of smoke from the cane fields. Families in the South prized sorghum for its nutritional value and natural richness, making it a treasured pantry staple. Some cooks whipped a little butter into the syrup for a glossy glaze, while others drizzled it straight from the jar, letting the bold taste speak for itself. Sorghum syrup waffles reflected African American culinary heritage and the ability to elevate basic ingredients into something memorable, creating a breakfast that lingered in both flavor and memory. Every crunchy bite, followed by sticky sweetness, felt like a slow morning worth savoring. Cornmeal mush with sorghum butter filled stomachs and provided sustained energy for the long cooking day ahead. The mush was made by slowly cooking coarse cornmeal in water or milk until it thickened into smooth porridge, stirred constantly to prevent lumps. Sorghum butter came from beating softened butter with dark sorghum syrup until it turned golden and spreadable, creating sweetness without expensive sugar. Served hot in bowls with generous dollops melting on top, this breakfast cost pennies but delivered warmth. In rural homes where money was tight but corn was abundant, this dish appeared regularly on Thanksgiving morning. Grandmothers understood that starting with hot food meant children would be patient while the feast was prepared. The cornmeal's earthy flavor balanced perfectly with sorghum's deep molasses notes. Families ate in shifts, with the cook eating last. This wasn't deprivation, but resourcefulness transformed into tradition. Fried potato cakes made from leftover mashed potatoes became Thanksgiving morning crispy treats that children begged for. Grandmothers mixed cold mashed potatoes with beaten eggs, chopped onions, and flour, forming patties that fried until golden brown and crusty. The outside turned crispy while the inside stayed soft and fluffy. These cakes used potatoes left from testing recipes or from earlier preparations. Served with butter or gravy, they provided filling breakfast that cost virtually nothing. In Black households where waste was never acceptable, fried potato cakes represented culinary intelligence. Children ate them hot off the skillet, burning their fingers but too eager to wait. Adults enjoyed them with coffee, appreciating how yesterday's side dish became today's featured breakfast. The cakes could be made quickly, freeing grandmothers to focus on dinner. Fried potato cakes proved resourcefulness could transform leftovers. Fried salmon patties for breakfast might seem unusual today, but for many African American families in the 60s and 70s, canned salmon was a dependable pantry staple that worked for any meal of the day. Grandparents mixed the salmon with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasoning, shaping it into patties that sizzled in the skillet until crisp. The smell filled the kitchen with something hearty and inviting, a bold start to the morning that made you feel ready for whatever the day demanded. Served with grits or biscuits, the patties tasted rich and satisfying, proof that canned ingredients could create meals full of flavor and comfort. Salmon was not expensive, but it felt special, which made breakfast feel special too. Children grew used to that savory taste long before they ever tried a restaurant version. Fried salmon patties were practical, filling, and unforgettable, a reminder of how creativity in the kitchen shaped so many childhood mornings. Country ham with red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast that woke the whole house before anyone sat down to eat. Thick slices of salt-cured ham hit a hot skillet, sizzling and popping until the edges turned crisp and caramelized. Once the ham was done, a splash of black coffee went straight into the pan, loosening up all those browned bits and transforming them into a smoky, savory gravy. That strange little mix of ham drippings and coffee was magic, salty, bitter, and rich all at once. Served with biscuits, the gravy soaked into every crumb, the kind of flavor that could only come from patience and cast iron. It was a dish that spoke of early mornings and hard work, the kind of food made to keep a farmer going until noon. Every family had their own method, their own rhythm of stirring and scraping the pan. Red-eye gravy was never about looks. It was about the smell, the sound, the taste of something honest. Country ham and red-eye gravy made even an ordinary morning feel proud. Pickled pig feet with bread were a dish that reflected both thrift and flavor, often served cold in rural communities as a morning meal. Pig feet, simmered and preserved in vinegar brine with spices, became a protein source that lasted far longer than fresh meat. Eaten with slices of bread, it was salty, tangy, and surprisingly filling. Families turned to it because it was cheap and practical, ensuring no part of the animal ever went to waste. The flavor carried a boldness that lingered, and though not every child enjoyed it, many adults looked back on it with fondness as a food of survival. In households where resources were scarce, a plate of pickled pig feet with bread could be enough to start the day. It was more than just sustenance. It was a dish that represented resilience and the ability to create meals from overlooked cuts. Pickled pig feet with bread carried strength, memory, and the taste of endurance in difficult times. Cane syrup toast was sweetness for hard times. When butter ran out and sugar was gone, grandparents made syrup from cane or brown sugar water simmered until thick. They spread it over hot bread, watching it soak into every crumb. It was simple, sticky, and sweet enough to feel like dessert even when it was breakfast. The syrup clung to fingers, the bread soft and warm. It was a small joy, a reminder that sweetness could always be found, even in struggle. That first bite tasted like love disguised as survival, and for many, it was the best part of the morning. The syrup dripped slow, shining under morning light, while kids licked it from their hands and laughed. It was a moment of delight before a long day, proof that life's smallest blessings could still feel grand. Every bite carried the taste of resilience, turning scarcity into sweetness. Buttered hominy with bacon brought a smoky, buttery aroma to African American breakfast tables of the 1970s, turning a humble grain into something rich and satisfying. White hominy kernels were simmered until tender, then sautéed in a heavy skillet with generous pats of butter. Crumbled strips of crisp bacon were folded in at the end, their savory fat blending with the buttery corn for layers of flavor. Some cooks added a sprinkle of black pepper or a pinch of red pepper flakes to deepen the taste, while others stirred in chopped green onions for brightness. Served alongside scrambled eggs or spooned over fresh cornbread, it offered hearty comfort that stuck with you through the morning. Buttered hominy with bacon celebrated both farm tradition and kitchen creativity, honoring a food once central to Native American diets and embraced by Southern cooks. Each bite carried the essence of smoky bacon and sweet corn, proving that simple, affordable ingredients could create a breakfast that felt luxurious without being complicated or costly. Gravy over rice was a breakfast swap that kept families fed when biscuits were too costly to make. Flour and fat gravy, seasoned with salt and pepper, was ladled over reheated rice to create a filling dish that stretched leftovers. It was hearty and sustaining, turning a side dish into the centerpiece of the morning meal. Families leaned on it because it required almost nothing extra, just the ability to stretch one meal into another. The flavor was simple, but it provided comfort, especially when eaten hot after cold nights. Children often carried bowls to the table with anticipation, while adults saw it as another way to avoid waste. Gravy over rice became a memory tied to thrift and practicality, proving that creativity was just as essential as ingredients during lean years. It was a dish that sustained both body and spirit, a reminder of how households carried themselves through difficult times with resourcefulness. Gravy over rice was survival turned into comfort food. Scrapple was the breakfast that turned thrift into art. Born in the mid-Atlantic, it began as a mix of pork trimmings, cornmeal, and spices, cooked until thick and poured into a loaf to set. Once chilled, it was sliced and fried until crisp on the outside and soft within. The result was savory, hearty, and unlike anything else, a flavor that lingered long after the plate was empty. For generations, scrapple was the farmer's first meal, eaten with eggs or syrup depending on the mood. It carried the spirit of practicality, nothing wasted, everything used. What began as a way to stretch ingredients became a tradition, one that still lives on in diners and family kitchens. Scrapple was breakfast for people who worked hard and appreciated the simple genius of turning leftovers into something extraordinary. It was humble, yes, but it was also pride in edible form. Salt pork gravy over bread was one of those breakfasts created from necessity, yet it tasted like something that belonged in a country diner. Grandparents would fry slices of salt pork until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped, releasing a savory aroma that meant a hearty meal was on the way. The drippings were whisked with flour and milk to create a thick, salty gravy that clung to the spoon, rich and filling despite its humble ingredients. Poured over toast or biscuits, it transformed simple bread into something warm and deeply satisfying. This was a breakfast made for long days and empty pockets, a way to stretch flavor as far as it could go. Children did not think about thrift. They just knew the gravy tasted good and made the morning feel special. The saltiness, the creaminess, and the soft bread soaking up every drop created a combination that lingered in both taste and memory. It was the kind of meal that carried families through tough times and still managed to feel generous. Even today, people who grew up with salt pork gravy remember it with a fondness that nothing else can quite match. Fried apples with cinnamon served alongside breakfast meats created Thanksgiving morning sweetness that balanced savory plates. Fresh apples were sliced thin and fried in butter with brown sugar and cinnamon until they softened and caramelized. The apples turned golden and sweet, their natural flavor intensified by the spices. Served beside eggs or sausage, they provided fruit that felt like indulgence. This dish appeared on Thanksgiving because fall apples were plentiful and affordable. Grandmothers prepared them quickly, knowing the sweet, savory combination would please everyone. Children loved the sugary apples, eating them eagerly. Adults appreciated how the fruit added variety without requiring much effort. Fried apples with cinnamon represented the Southern tradition of balancing meals with both sweet and savory elements, creating satisfaction through contrast that made every plate more interesting. Potato cakes from leftover mash were the kind of breakfast that proved nothing in the kitchen ever had to be thrown away. Grandparents mixed cold mashed potatoes with flour or cornmeal, shaping the mixture into patties that fried beautifully in a hot skillet. The outside crisped into a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft, warm, and comforting. It was a thrifty breakfast that used leftovers creatively and fed everyone well without costing anything extra. The cakes were often served plain, sometimes with syrup, and sometimes with butter melting across the top. They tasted like resourcefulness, like making the most of what you had, like the kind of wisdom passed down quietly from generation to generation. Even today, people remember those potato cakes as a breakfast that felt both humble and full of heart. Biscuits and sausage gravy were the heart and soul of country breakfasts. Flaky biscuits baked fresh, split open, and drenched in a thick, peppery gravy made from sausage drippings, flour, and milk. The smell alone could wake the whole house. It was a meal that filled the stomach and soothed the spirit, one that required no fancy tools, only time and care. The gravy clung to every crumb, rich and savory, while the biscuits absorbed just enough to stay soft. This was the food of hospitality, the dish you made when guests came or when you simply wanted to treat your own family right. Every cook had their secret: more pepper, a touch of butter, maybe a pinch of sage. But no matter how it was made, it always meant comfort. Biscuits and sausage gravy were the definition of generosity served hot. Hot water. Cornbread was the taste of resilience fried golden. Made from cornmeal, salt, and boiling water, it took almost nothing to prepare. Just heat, hands, and a little patience. Grandparents mixed it until thick, shaped small patties and dropped them into sizzling oil. The kitchen filled with that sound, soft crackles and promise. The outside crisped brown, the inside stayed tender, and the smell of corn filled the air. Served hot with greens, beans, or on its own, It was both bread and meal. It was the working person's comfort, made quick and eaten proud. No milk, no eggs, no fancy tools, just skill passed down through hands that refused to give up. Each bite was a memory of endurance, of turning a few ingredients into a reason to keep going. Collard green and onion hash gave leafy greens a starring role, turning a traditional dinner side into a savory breakfast companion. Fresh collard greens were sliced thin and quickly sautéed with sweet onions, a little garlic, and a splash of vegetable broth until tender yet vibrant. The result was a smoky, nutrient-rich hash that paired beautifully with eggs, grits, or cornbread. Some families added diced potatoes for extra heartiness, while others seasoned with a pinch of red pepper flakes to wake up the taste buds. This dish reflected a deep appreciation for garden vegetables and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who brought dinner flavors to the morning table. Collard green and onion hash provided iron, vitamins, and a satisfying warmth that lasted through long days. Its quick preparation and bold taste made it a weekday favorite, while its connection to Southern tradition made it feel timeless, proving that breakfast could be as wholesome and flavorful as any evening meal. Sausage patties with fried apples made mornings feel rich, even when the pantry was bare. The sausage sizzled in a skillet, its fat spitting softly, while the kitchen filled with the smell of spice and salt. Apples, sliced thin, were dropped into the same pan afterward, soaking up the drippings until their edges caramelized. The result was a perfect balance of flavors: smoky meat and sweet fruit, savory and soft. Served side by side, they made an unlikely pair that just worked. The meal was hearty, comforting, and practical. 2 ingredients stretched to feed many. It was the kind of breakfast that fueled both body and heart, reminding families that creativity was the secret to good cooking. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness, of turning what you had into something worth remembering. Sometimes a touch of cinnamon or brown sugar was added to the apples, the sweetness blending with the sausage's spice to make every forkful unforgettable. It was a dish that filled bellies and lifted moods, proof that food didn't need luxury to feel abundant. This pairing of opposites, salt and sugar, crisp and soft, became a symbol of balance in the Southern kitchen. It was comfort on a plate, built from simple genius and the magic of making do. Canned salmon patties with scrambled eggs provided Thanksgiving morning seafood when fresh fish wasn't available or affordable. Canned salmon was mixed with breadcrumbs, beaten eggs, and chopped onions, formed into patties and fried until crispy. Served alongside scrambled eggs, this breakfast offered double protein. The salmon patties cost little since canned fish was shelf-stable and economical. In Black households where Friday fish traditions remained strong, having seafood on Thanksgiving morning felt appropriate. The crispy coating contrasted with soft eggs, creating textural variety. Children picked at the salmon bones if any remained. Adults appreciated how the canned fish provided omega-3 nutrition without requiring fresh market trips. Canned salmon patties with eggs represented practical protein solutions that honored cultural food preferences while respecting limited budgets. Sorghum syrup on hot biscuits was a rural breakfast tradition rooted in the fields and farms where sorghum was grown and milled long before maple syrup ever became common. The syrup was thick, earthy, and rich, with a sweetness that felt deeper than sugar. Grandparents would split open hot biscuits, steam rising, and drizzle sorghum across the soft center until it glistened. The flavor was bold and comforting, slightly smoky, and entirely unique. It tasted like the land itself, like seasons of harvest and the steady work of hands that knew how to make every ingredient count. Biscuits with sorghum were inexpensive, filling, and quietly indulgent in their own rustic way. Families loved them because the syrup lasted long, cost little, and carried the taste of home. Even today, those who grew up with sorghum syrup remember its distinct sweetness with a kind of affection that never fades. Fried salt pork with eggs was breakfast before bacon took over the world. Thick slabs of cured pork belly hit a cast-iron skillet and began to sizzle, releasing a fragrance that woke the whole house. The fat crisped into edges that crackled with salt and flavor, while the drippings in the pan turned liquid gold. Into that same pan went the eggs, frying in the rendered fat until the whites blistered and the yolks gleamed. It was salty, rich, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that stayed with you through a day of hard labor. No one worried about cholesterol or calories back then. Food like this was about survival, satisfaction, and a little morning joy. Fried salt pork was poor man's bacon, but it never tasted like second best. Served with biscuits or grits, it brought warmth and strength to the table. It was a breakfast that said, "You'll make it through today." The smell lingered long after breakfast ended, clinging to aprons and walls like a memory of comfort. Sometimes a drizzle of blackstrap molasses or a spoon of apple butter cut through the salt, turning it into something almost sweet. Every bite carried the weight of hard work and the warmth of home, a reminder that strength could start from the simplest pan. Hominy pancakes were another clever way families stretched resources into filling meals. Hominy, boiled corn kernels treated with lye, was folded into simple flour batter and fried on a hot griddle until crisp on the edges. The result was a pancake that was hearty, chewy, and rich in flavor. Families leaned on this dish because hominy was inexpensive, filling, and often available in bulk. These pancakes were served plain or topped with syrup, molasses, or even just butter when sugar was scarce. Children enjoyed the slightly nutty texture, while adults appreciated that it carried them through long hours of work. Hominy pancakes were tied to heritage too, with roots reaching back to Native American food traditions that influenced Southern cooking. They were a reminder of resilience and cultural continuity, showing how simple staples could be reinvented to meet new needs. Hominy pancakes filled stomachs, but they also filled mornings with the comfort of tradition and the creativity of making do. Grits and scrambled eggs were the foundation of the Southern morning. Grandparents stirred the grits slow, keeping them smooth and thick while eggs cooked soft and golden beside them. The smell of butter, salt, and heat filled the air, a smell that meant the day was beginning right. The two foods shared a plate, one creamy, one fluffy, both symbols of care. It was quick, affordable, and enough to keep the family full until noon. Sometimes a slice of bacon or a spoon of gravy joined the dish, but even plain, it felt whole. This was the meal of workers, of early risers and hopeful hearts. Every bite was steady, warm, and simple, a reminder that the best things in life often came from the smallest pots. The rhythm of whisking grits and scrambling eggs was morning music, soft and sure. It was eaten before the day's labor began, giving strength and calm in equal measure. Each bowl held a quiet promise that even in struggle, comfort could always be found at the table. Hoppin' John morning bowl carried the luck and legacy of the South into every spoonful, blending black-eyed peas, fluffy rice, and smoky bacon for a meal steeped in tradition. Peas were simmered until tender with onions, garlic, and a hint of pork, then spooned over freshly cooked rice so the savory juices soaked into every grain. A sprinkle of green onions or a splash of pepper vinegar added brightness, while some cooks stirred in diced peppers for extra color and flavor. This dish had long been served on New Year's Day for prosperity, but in the 1970s, many African American families enjoyed it year-round as a hearty breakfast. It offered protein, fiber, and deep flavor that sustained workers and school children alike. Hoppin' John morning bowl reminded each generation of the history carried in its ingredients, from West African roots to Southern kitchens, proving that food could nourish both body and spirit while keeping cultural memory alive with every bite of smoky, satisfying goodness. Homemade sausage patties made from pork scraps and sage-filled Thanksgiving kitchens with aromas announcing the holiday had arrived. Grandmothers ground leftover pork with seasonings, forming small patties that fried up crispy and savory. These weren't store-bought links, but homemade creations using every part of the pig, mixed with dried sage, black pepper, red pepper flakes, and salt. The patties sizzled in cast-iron skillets, their fat rendering out to create crispy edges while interiors stayed juicy. Served alongside eggs or grits, they provided protein-sustaining families through morning preparations. Making sausage from scratch meant controlling ingredients and stretching meat further than store-bought allowed. Children watched grandmothers work, learning techniques passed down through generations. The spices were measured by hand, creating unique family flavors. These patties appeared at Thanksgiving because holiday butchering provided fresh pork scraps, perfect for grinding. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were the quick morning version of a beloved staple that had already lived lifetimes in African American kitchens. A bowl of cornmeal mixed with boiling water created a dough that came together almost instantly, proving that good food did not need complicated steps or expensive supplies. Grandparents shaped the dough with their hands, patting each cake gently before laying it into the skillet where it sizzled and tightened into a crisp golden edge. These smaller breakfast cakes were eaten warm, often with a smear of jam, a drizzle of honey, or just a little butter melting across the top. The texture was dense but soft, hearty but still light enough to enjoy early in the morning. It tasted like home, like tradition, like something passed down not through written recipes but through practiced hands that knew exactly how the batter should feel. These cakes made mornings easier, faster, and far more delicious than anyone expected from such simple ingredients. Children loved them because they felt like little treats, bite-sized comforts that fit perfectly into small hands. Adults loved them because they stretched the pantry and kept everyone fed without fuss or cost. Hot water cornbread breakfast cakes were proof that a skillet, some cornmeal, and a steady hand could create something unforgettable day after day. Poached eggs on toast were breakfast elegance in a world that rarely had time for it. Water simmered just below boiling, and eggs were lowered gently, their whites curling around the yolks like soft silk. When lifted out and set on buttered toast, they gleamed, tender, trembling, and perfect. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed. It was a dish that made even a modest kitchen feel refined. The first cut of the knife released a golden stream that soaked into the bread, rich and warm. This breakfast carried a sense of calm, the quiet kind that came before a day's labor. Grandparents who made poached eggs treated it like a ritual, never rushed, always patient. It was proof that even in lean times, beauty could live on the breakfast plate. Poached eggs on toast weren't about luxury. They were about intention, about giving the morning the dignity it deserved. Homemade apple butter toast was a breakfast that stretched the fruits of summer into the long months of winter. Families would cook apples down with spices until they formed a thick, sweet spread, preserving it in jars for the cold seasons. Spread over stale bread, biscuits, or cornbread, apple butter transformed plain staples into something comforting. It was a way of saving harvests, ensuring that fruit could be enjoyed long after the orchards were bare. Apple butter toast was often served to children before school, giving them a sense of sweetness and strength in the mornings. Adults valued it for its practicality, as a single jar could last weeks and provide flavor to otherwise bland meals. It was not just a spread, but a memory of orchards, harvest work, and the determination to make food last. Apple butter toast became a symbol of both survival and warmth, offering families a taste of sweetness during hard times. Fried bologna and eggs were the kind of breakfast that came from both love and necessity. The skillet hit the stove before the sun came up, its heat waking the house faster than any clock could. Grandparents sliced slits in the edges of the bologna so it would not curl, laying each piece flat to sizzle in the pan. The smell was sharp and smoky, filling the kitchen with a promise that no one would start the day hungry. Once browned and blistered at the edges, the bologna came out and the eggs went in, frying in the same grease for flavor that no oil could match. Some mornings they scrambled them with onions. Other days they fried them hard with crisp edges. Served on white bread or next to grits, it was a meal that filled stomachs and spirits alike. Kids called it breakfast meat, never thinking about how little it cost, just how good it tasted. It was a worker's breakfast, the kind that kept strength in the body and dignity in the home. The bologna might have come from a bargain pack, but when it hit that skillet, it turned into gold. It was not about luxury. It was about knowing how to make something small feel mighty. The sound of grease popping was a morning song, one that told you life might be hard, but you would always eat. Catfish and grits gave weekend mornings a soulful edge, pairing crisp fried fish with creamy stone-ground grits in a combination that felt both rustic and celebratory. Fresh river catfish fillets were seasoned with salt, pepper, and a dusting of cornmeal before sliding into hot oil where they sizzled to a golden brown. The grits simmered slowly on the stove, enriched with butter and a touch of cream for a silky texture that balanced the crunch of the fish. Families often gathered around big skillets of catfish on Sundays after church, turning breakfast into a communal event. Some added a squeeze of lemon or a dash of hot sauce to brighten the flavors, while others served sliced tomatoes or greens on the side. Catfish and grits carried the heritage of southern waterways and the ingenuity of African-American cooks who transformed local catches into a beloved morning feast that satisfied hunger and celebrated the bounty of rivers and farms alike. Cocoa powder porridge was a rare treat for children, transforming a simple breakfast into something sweet and comforting. Hot cereal, made from cornmeal or oats, was flavored with a spoonful of cocoa powder whisked into the pot. The cocoa gave it a richness and sweetness that brightened mornings, even when sugar was scarce. Families leaned on this dish as a way to bring joy to children during hard times, ensuring that breakfast carried not only nutrition, but happiness. For adults, it was a reminder of small indulgences made possible through creativity. Cocoa powder porridge was not common, but when it appeared, it was cherished and remembered. It symbolized resilience, the way families found ways to stretch the smallest luxuries into meaningful experiences. Even decades later, people recalled it with fondness, a dish that turned struggle into memory. Cocoa powder porridge was survival with sweetness, the kind of food that stayed alive in the hearts of those who ate it. Gravy-soaked toast, known in military slang as SOS, became a homemade classic when adapted with love instead of rations. Leftover pan drippings from sausage or bacon were whisked with flour and milk, transforming into a thick, creamy gravy flecked with pepper. Instead of plain white bread, home cooks used toast made fresh that morning, letting it soak up the savory richness. It was simple but deeply satisfying, the kind of meal that filled empty stomachs and stretched scarce ingredients. Families learned to make it during hard times, and it stuck around because it was just that good. The combination of soft bread and velvety gravy made even an ordinary morning feel generous. Gravy-soaked toast was more than frugality. It was comfort made from care. Some added bits of sausage for heartiness, while others poured the gravy over biscuits instead, depending on what was on hand. It became a breakfast of survival and pride, the kind of food that tasted better than it had any right to. The aroma of sizzling drippings and toasting bread brought life to quiet mornings, reminding everyone that simple food done right could feed more than hunger. Gravy-soaked toast was an act of everyday kindness, a gesture that said, "We have enough, and we'll share it." Butter sugar toast was the quick, sweet breakfast many children rushed toward before school, made from nothing more than bread, butter, and a sprinkle of sugar. Grandparents spread the butter all the way to the edges, making sure every bite would melt just right. The toast warmed the sugar until it softened slightly, creating a delicate crunch that felt almost like a treat. It was simple, fast, and inexpensive, yet it tasted like something far more indulgent. For many children, this was the breakfast they could hold in one hand while tying their shoes with the other. It tasted like busy mornings, like running out the door with crumbs on your shirt, like the gentle love of someone who wanted you fed. Even when there was no time, butter sugar toast may be overlooked today, but the memory of it still lingers for anyone who grew up on its warm sweetness. But oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar and butter was Thanksgiving morning warmth that stuck to ribs and provided lasting energy. The oatmeal was cooked slowly with water or milk until thick and creamy, then sweetened with brown sugar that melted into caramel sweetness. A pat of butter stirred in added richness. This breakfast was economical because oats were cheap, filling, and lasted through cold mornings. In Black households where children needed fuel before the day's activities, oatmeal provided complex carbohydrates that released energy slowly. Grandmothers cooked large pots, serving bowls to everyone gathered around the table. Children might have preferred sweet treats, but learned to appreciate oatmeal's comforting warmth. Adults valued how the simple bowl kept hunger at bay for hours. Oatmeal with brown sugar and butter represented practical nutrition that didn't require expensive ingredients but still tasted good. Coffee milk for kids was one of those small morning rituals that made children feel grown, even though the drink was mostly warm milk with only a tiny splash of coffee. Parents and grandparents mixed it carefully, just enough coffee to tint the milk a light tan and add the faintest whisper of that roasted smell adults relied on to start their day. It was soothing, warm, and familiar. The kind of drink that made sleepy children perk up before school without giving them the full strength of adult coffee. Many African American households use this as a way to include children in the morning rhythm, letting them feel part of the adult world while still keeping things gentle. The taste was mild and slightly sweet, especially when a bit of sugar was added, and it had a comforting creaminess that stuck with you long after the cup was empty. The mornings felt quieter back then, slower, filled with the soft sounds of spoons stirring and radios humming low in the background. Coffee milk was not just a drink, it was a moment, a shared start to the day that made you feel loved and included. Even now, the memory of that warm cup brings people back to kitchens filled with steam, conversation, and the steady comfort of family. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was breakfast in its purest, humblest form. Yesterday's cornbread, crumbled and covered with cold buttermilk, became something both refreshing and filling. The texture was soft, yet hearty, the tang of buttermilk cutting through the sweetness of the corn. It was eaten straight from the bowl, sometimes with a spoon, sometimes with a piece of bread to scoop it up. To some, it was comfort food. To others, it was necessity. But for everyone who grew up with it, it was memory of grandparents who never wasted a crumb and knew how to make even the plainest food taste right. It was a dish that belonged to no one and everyone at once, simple enough to make but impossible to forget. Cornbread and buttermilk was proof that contentment could live in a single bowl. Leftover pie for breakfast was a common occurrence in large households where nothing was wasted. Sweet potato pie, chess pie, or fruit pies baked the night before were often sliced and eaten cold in the morning with coffee or milk. For children, it was an exciting way to begin the day, while adults saw it as practical and filling. It reflected the rhythm of large families, where every meal had to stretch, and desserts could not be reserved only for evenings. Leftover pie carried both joy and necessity, showing how households turned indulgence into sustenance. The flavors of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sweet roots lingered, making mornings brighter even when other meals were sparse. Eating pie for breakfast symbolized both frugality and comfort, a way of preserving energy and spirit in difficult times. Leftover pie for breakfast became a fond memory for many, a dish that reflected resilience and the creativity of stretching food in every way possible. Leftover collard greens and rice turned yesterday's dinner into today's survival. Grandparents reheated the greens slowly, letting their smoky flavor return, then folded in cooked rice until everything blended into one soulful dish. The broth turned the rice tender, absorbing all the spice and fat left behind from the pot. It was food with memory. Every bite carried yesterday's work and tomorrow's strength. The greens, once wilted, took on new life beside the soft rice, becoming breakfast that satisfied the hunger of both body and spirit. A drizzle of vinegar added brightness, a reminder that even hardship could taste alive. It was warm, it was nourishing, and it was never wasted. Families gathered around small tables, thankful that nothing from the night before went forgotten. In the quiet clatter of spoons and bowls, there was gratitude for every grain, every leaf, every bite that kept them moving forward. Some mornings, the pot would bubble again with new life, stretching the last of the greens just a little further. The meal wasn't just food, it was testimony, proof that nothing humble ever truly disappeared. It carried lessons of endurance, teaching that the best things often came from what was left behind. Molasses oatmeal filled kitchens with the deep aroma of blackstrap sweetness, offering an iron-rich start that was both frugal and indulgent. Old-fashioned oats simmered slowly in milk or water until creamy, then received a generous spoonful of thick sorghum or blackstrap molasses. The dark syrup melted into the oats, tinting them a warm brown and adding a flavor both smoky and sweet. Many families used molasses not only for its taste, but also for its mineral strength, a natural source of iron and energy. Some sprinkled chopped nuts or sliced bananas on top for extra texture, while others added a pinch of cinnamon for gentle spice. Molasses oatmeal spoke to a time when nourishment and economy were equally important, turning a humble grain into a breakfast that felt rich and sustaining. It remained a quiet favorite of African American households, a reminder that even the simplest bowls could carry history, health, and the comforting weight of tradition with every spoonful. Buttermilk pancakes with cane syrup were Thanksgiving morning treats that made children feel special before the elaborate dinner. The pancakes were made from scratch using buttermilk that created tender, fluffy texture with slightly tangy flavor. Cane syrup, cheaper and more accessible than maple syrup in the South, was poured generously over stacks of golden cakes. This breakfast felt indulgent, even though the ingredients were basic pantry staples. Grandmothers made large batches, flipping pancakes on hot griddles while managing other tasks. The buttermilk's acidity reacted with baking soda, creating lightness that made each bite melt in the mouth. Children counted how many pancakes they ate, competing with siblings. Adults enjoyed them slowly, appreciating the care that went into making breakfast from scratch. Buttermilk pancakes with cane syrup represented balance between thrift and celebration. Fried fatback with biscuits was the kind of breakfast that came from deep tradition, from years when every part of the animal was used and nothing was taken for granted. Before bacon became the breakfast standard, fatback was the salty, sizzling star of the morning. Grandparents sliced it thick and fried it until the edges crisped and curled, releasing a savory aroma that filled the whole house. The drippings soaked into fresh biscuits, turning them into something rich and flavorful without needing butter or gravy. The combination was simple but powerful. A pairing that carried families through long days of labor, and school fatback was inexpensive, accessible, and packed with flavor, which made it a natural choice for rural homes and city kitchens alike. Children grew up associating that salty crunch with mornings spent around crowded tables, hands reaching for biscuits still warm from the oven. Even though fatback is rarely seen in modern breakfast routines, the memory of it remains strong for those who grew up with its bold taste. It represents a time when meals came from resourcefulness, from tradition, and from knowing how to make the most of what you had. Molasses on hot biscuits was the taste of sweetness earned through patience. When sugar was expensive or hard to find, molasses filled the gap, dark, thick, and full of depth. Hot biscuits came out of the oven steaming, split open by hand, and dripping with butter before a spoonful of molasses turned them into something heavenly. The syrup pooled and soaked into the soft crumb, leaving behind a shine that caught the morning light. It was sticky on the fingers, rich on the tongue, and comforting in a way only handmade food can be. For many, it was the only sweet treat of the day, but that never made it ordinary. The flavor was bold, smoky, and deep. A reminder of cane fields, wood stoves, and family hands passing down recipes without a word written. Molasses on biscuits was the kind of breakfast that could make even the hardest morning feel gentle again. In the simplest kitchens, where nothing was wasted and every crumb mattered, this pairing stood as a small luxury, proof that joy could come from the humblest of ingredients. Cane syrup biscuits were one of the sweetest ways families could begin a day when sugar was a luxury. Freshly baked biscuits were split open and drizzled with thick cane syrup, a cheaper sweetener that was widely available in the South. This breakfast offered comfort and energy, especially for children heading to school or adults preparing for long days of labor. Cane syrup added richness to otherwise plain bread, transforming simple biscuits into a treat. It was a dish tied directly to the land, since cane syrup came from local harvests and represented self-reliance. Families treasured it because it gave sweetness without breaking the budget, a rare indulgence during lean times. Cane syrup biscuits became more than breakfast. They were symbols of hope, resourcefulness, and the sweetness people clung to even in struggle. The dish carried both nourishment and spirit, helping fuel resilience during mornings that demanded strength. For many, it was the taste of home and perseverance. Stewed apples with cinnamon and lard were the warmth of winter mornings in the South. Grandparents would peel the apples by hand, their fingers quick and sure, tossing each slice into an iron pot that hissed when the fat hit the heat. A spoonful of lard went first. There was no butter to spare, melting into a glossy pool that would coat every piece of fruit. Sugar was added if there was any to be found, but most times the sweetness came from the apples themselves, coaxed out by patience and low flame. Cinnamon or nutmeg, if there was some hidden in the back of the cupboard, turned the smell into something magical. The apples softened slowly, curling into tender ribbons that glowed like amber. The air filled with a warmth that made even the poorest kitchen feel rich. Served over biscuits or eaten plain from a bowl, it was the kind of meal that made children quiet with joy. It cost almost nothing but felt like everything. Grandparents said it was food for the soul, and they were right. It soothed hunger, calmed hearts, and brought everyone closer to the table. Even when times were lean, stewed apples with lard reminded families that comfort could be made from what was already there. It wasn't just breakfast, it was love made visible through steam and sugar. Rice and raisin breakfast bowl turned leftover rice into a cozy, lightly sweet start to the day, perfect for stretching ingredients while feeding the family well. Cold rice was warmed in a saucepan with fresh milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a pinch of salt until creamy and fragrant. Plump raisins were stirred in, releasing their sweetness as they swelled in the heat. Some cooks added a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg for extra comfort, while others drizzled a bit of honey just before serving. This simple dish recalled generations of frugal but flavorful cooking, proving that nothing needed to be wasted to create a hearty meal. African American families valued its efficiency and warmth, often serving it with buttered toast or fruit on the side. Rice and raisin breakfast bowl demonstrated how the ingenuity of home cooks could transform plain leftovers into something soothing and delicious. A bowl that nourished both body and spirit during busy mornings or quiet weekend breakfasts alike. Salted fish cakes for breakfast carried a flavor that was bold, practical, and tied to tradition. Families made them by mixing scraps of salted fish with meal or leftover potatoes, shaping patties, and frying them crisp in a skillet. The result was savory, filling, and inexpensive, making it a reliable protein source when other meats were far out of reach. In coastal communities or areas where salted fish was a common trade, this dish became a morning standard, paired often with eggs if the household could spare them. Children sometimes found the taste strong, but adults appreciated its sustenance and the way it stretched simple ingredients. Fish cakes often carried the memory of family gatherings, with parents teaching children how to prepare them just as their parents once had. It was a dish that reflected survival, thrift, and culinary creativity, embodying how overlooked scraps could become the backbone of a morning meal. Salted fish cakes for breakfast held both history and hunger in balance, fueling resilience through humble bites. Coffee and sugar cookies might sound like dessert, but to grandparents, it was breakfast worth rising early for. The coffee was strong and dark, the kind brewed in enamel pots that never left the stove. The cookies were soft or crisp, depending on the household, often flavored with a hint of vanilla or nutmeg. Dipped into the steaming cup, they softened just enough to melt in your mouth. It was a quiet morning ritual, not rushed, not fancy, but full of grace. Adults called it a quick bite. Children called it heaven. There was something timeless about it, the sweetness balancing the bitterness, the warmth balancing the chill of dawn. For many, this pairing was not indulgence, it was peace. Coffee and sugar cookies were the kind of breakfast that taught you to slow down, to savor, and to start the day grateful. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were the kind of breakfast you could throw together in seconds, a heavy, sticky, sweet combination that kept kids full for hours. Grandparents spread thick peanut butter on soft sandwich bread and drizzled corn syrup over it, letting the syrup sink into the peanut butter until the whole thing clung together in a dense, satisfying bite. It was quick, cheap, and strong enough to carry a child through school mornings when there was no time for hot food. The sweetness blended with the saltiness of the peanut butter, creating a flavor that felt indulgent even though it came from pantry staples. Working households relied on this breakfast because it was dependable, affordable, and guaranteed to quiet hunger. Children loved its candy-like richness, even if the adults knew it was simply the best option available. Peanut butter and corn syrup sandwiches were a reminder of mornings shaped by love, necessity, and whatever ingredients were within reach. Bacon drippings gravy over day-old cornbread was Thanksgiving morning thrift that transformed yesterday's bread into today's satisfying meal. Bacon grease saved from frying was heated in skillets. Flour was whisked in to create roux, then milk was added to make creamy gravy. This savory sauce was poured generously over crumbled day-old cornbread that soaked it up like a sponge. The result was filling, flavorful, and cost virtually nothing. Grandmothers never threw away bacon drippings, storing them in jars to use for cooking and flavoring. The gravy provided fat and calories needed during cold months, while the cornbread offered substance. Children ate this without complaint, enjoying the rich flavors. Adults appreciated the ingenuity of making leftovers feel intentional. Bacon drippings gravy over cornbread proved that even the simplest ingredients could create satisfaction. Sautéed onions and eggs were a simple breakfast that leaned on pantry staples when meat was scarce or too costly. Grandparents sliced onions thin and cooked them slowly until they softened and browned, releasing their sweetness into the skillet. Then came the eggs, cracked right over the top and scrambled gently so the onions intertwined with every bite. The result was savory, aromatic, and surprisingly comforting. This was working-class fuel, a breakfast that tasted far richer than its ingredients implied children might not have asked for it. But once the onions and eggs were on the plate, the flavor spoke for itself. It was warm, filling, and quietly satisfying, the kind of meal that taught you how to appreciate the depth hidden in simple ingredients. Sautéed onions and eggs were proof that good cooking came from skill, not expense. Lard-fried corn pones were the kind of breakfast that stuck to your ribs and carried you through long hours of work or school. These dense corn patties were mixed from cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt before being fried golden in sizzling lard. The flavor was simple but deeply satisfying, with the crisp edges giving way to a soft interior that felt hearty in every bite. For families with little to spare, corn pones were portable and cheap, making them an everyday staple as well as a meal to take out into the fields. Children often carried them wrapped in cloth, while adults relied on them with strong coffee to start their mornings. They were versatile too, eaten plain, dipped in molasses, or even crumbled into buttermilk for a different kind of breakfast. Lard-fried corn pones were never fancy, but they were dependable, and that made them unforgettable. They represented resourcefulness and strength, the kind of food that reflected both necessity and comfort in kitchens where nothing went to waste. Homemade syrup biscuits were the dessert of lean times, a sweetness that came from patience, not price. The biscuits were soft and warm, baked from scratch on mornings when life felt heavy. Grandparents made syrup by simmering brown sugar and water together until it bubbled thick like honey. The smell alone could lift a tired heart. When poured over hot biscuits, the syrup soaked in, glistening like amber. Kids would press their fingers into the bread, catching the drips before they cooled. It was sticky, messy, and wonderful. A treat that felt special even without anything store-bought. Homemade syrup biscuits turned necessity into celebration, a tradition passed through generations. Each bite tasted like care, sweetened by the effort it took to make something from nothing. The syrup shimmered in the morning light, a small reminder that sweetness could survive even in struggle. Every plate carried comfort, laughter, and the quiet joy of making the most out of little. Cornbread and buttermilk was breakfast born of simplicity and strength. Grandparents crumbled leftover cornbread into bowls, poured cold buttermilk over the top, and stirred until soft and thick. It was tangy, creamy, and filling, the perfect meal when cupboards were bare. The sourness of the buttermilk balanced the sweetness of the bread, making each bite taste new again. It was food that cooled the body in summer, soothed it in winter, and satisfied hunger all year long. No stove, no fuss, just ingredients that were always on hand. It was eaten with a spoon, quiet and steady, often in the same bowls used for supper. There was nothing fancy about it, but it carried the wisdom of generations: never waste, never want. It was a poor person's breakfast, yes, but one made with pride. Some folks added a pinch of salt or a drizzle of syrup, but it never needed more than it had. The clinking of spoons and the sound of quiet chewing told stories of endurance and contentment. In a world that asked for more, this humble meal taught gratitude for what was already there. Pan-fried liver mush with mustard on toast was Thanksgiving morning protein using preserved organ meat to create hearty breakfast. Liver mush, that Appalachian creation combining pork liver with cornmeal and spices, was sliced and fried until the exterior crisped while the interior stayed creamy. Served on toasted bread with sharp mustard, it provided sustaining nutrition. This breakfast appeared in Black households influenced by Appalachian foodways, where cultures overlapped. The liver mush was economical because organ meats were cheaper than muscle meat but packed with nutrients. Grandmothers fried it quickly, creating breakfast that lasted through morning preparations. Children acquired the taste gradually. Adults valued how the small serving provided significant protein and energy. Pan-fried liver mush with mustard represented the blending of regional traditions and practical wisdom of using every part of available animals. Fried bologna biscuits were the kind of breakfast that made you feel like you were getting something special even when money was tight. Grandparents would slice thick rounds of bologna and lay them into a popping skillet, letting the edges curl and brown until the flavor deepened into something smoky and rich. The hot slices were tucked into fresh biscuits, often homemade or leftover from the night before, absorbing just enough of the bologna's warmth to soften perfectly. It was salty, savory, and incredibly satisfying, the kind of handheld breakfast that felt almost luxurious despite coming from inexpensive ingredients. Children loved the way the biscuit crumbled slightly with each bite, mixing with the bold taste of the fried bologna. Adults appreciated how easy it was to make and how far it could stretch the budget. This was the kind of food that reminded families that good meals did not need fancy ingredients or long cooking times. All they needed was a skillet, some biscuits, and someone who knew how to make simple food feel unforgettable. Apple butter toast was the kind of breakfast that came with a story. Thick, spiced apple butter spread over warm toast turned ordinary mornings into something memorable. The butter's deep brown color came from hours of slow cooking. Apples simmered with sugar, cinnamon, and cloves until they transformed into a smooth, fragrant paste. Grandparents often made it in big batches, filling jars to last through winter. Each spoonful carried the patience of a day spent stirring at the stove. On cold mornings, that same spread met the crackle of toast, melting slightly into the crumb, releasing a scent that filled the whole kitchen. It was sweet but grounded, rich but not heavy, the taste of comfort that lasted long after the meal was done. Apple butter toast wasn't about extravagance. It was about preservation, tradition, and the art of making something beautiful from what you grew. Cornmeal dumplings in milk were a dish that blended simplicity with comfort, making them a favorite in many households when mornings were cold and food was scarce. Dumplings were mixed from cornmeal and flour, shaped into small rounds, and simmered in sweetened milk until soft and tender. The result was both filling and slightly sweet, a dish that could serve as either breakfast or dessert depending on how it was prepared. For families with children, it was often given in the morning to ensure they had energy for school. Adults relied on it as well, especially when more costly staples like bacon or sausage were unavailable. Cornmeal dumplings in milk carried a sense of warmth and security, proof that even the humblest ingredients could create satisfaction. It was a dish remembered not only for its flavor, but for the way it stretched supplies in hard times. It became part of the rhythm of survival, tying family memories to the shared strength of the table. Leftover rice pancakes were the invention of hungry mornings. Cold rice mixed with flour, egg, and a little sugar turned into batter, then fried into soft golden cakes. They crisped at the edges and steamed in the center, smelling like comfort reborn. Grandparents drizzled syrup or butter over the top, calling it a special breakfast even when it was born from scraps. The pancakes were sweet and tender, their warmth stretching far beyond the plate. Every bite carried gratitude, a quiet celebration of resourcefulness that turned leftovers into joy. The sound of the batter hitting the skillet was soft but sure, like morning routine meeting creativity. The first pancake was always eaten standing at the stove, still hot, still bubbling with syrup. It tasted like invention, like pride disguised as sweetness. It was survival dressed up as a treat, and it never failed to bring a smile. Baked cheese grits casserole prepared the night before allowed grandmothers to focus on Thanksgiving dinner, while breakfast took care of itself. Cooked grits were mixed with eggs, sharp cheddar cheese, butter, and milk, then poured into baking dishes and refrigerated overnight. Thanksgiving morning, the casserole baked until set and golden, filling kitchens with savory aromas. This breakfast could feed large groups with minimal morning effort. The eggs and cheese provided protein, while the grits delivered comforting carbohydrates. Families cut squares and served them hot, sometimes with hot sauce. The casserole represented forward-thinking meal planning. It could be prepared when time allowed, then baked when needed. Children loved the cheesy richness, while adults appreciated the practicality. Baked cheese grits casserole proved planning ahead created stress-free Thanksgiving mornings. Sweetened cornflake fritters were one of the quirkiest breakfasts to come out of mid-century kitchens, a playful mix of crushed cornflakes, beaten egg, and a bit of sugar fried like pancakes. Grandparents stirred the ingredients together until the mixture clumped, then dropped spoonfuls into a hot skillet, flattening them gently so they crisped around the edges. They were sweet, crunchy, and warm, the kind of breakfast children loved because it felt fun and different from anything else served during the week. The fritters browned quickly, giving them a toasty flavor that paired well with syrup or powdered sugar. They were inexpensive, easy to make, and a clever way to use the bottom crumbs of a cereal box. Sweetened cornflake fritters tasted like creativity, like Saturday mornings, and like the joy grandparents found in making something simple feel magical. Fried cornmeal cakes were the working man's pancakes, crisp at the edges, tender in the middle, and made from the same cornmeal that showed up at every Southern table. Mixed with milk, eggs, and a little salt, the batter went into a hot skillet and came out golden and bubbling. They could be eaten plain or drizzled with syrup, honey, or even a little molasses depending on what was in the pantry. The smell of frying cornmeal was unmistakable, sweet and nutty, a scent that meant comfort was close. These cakes filled stomachs and hearts alike, simple enough for every day but special enough to remember. They were the breakfast of farmers, laborers, and children who learned that love came in humble servings. Fried cornmeal cakes didn't just feed, they fortified, reminding everyone that a good day started with something made by hand. Sweet potato coffee cakes were born of Southern improvisation, where fresh sweet potatoes were mashed into dough to stretch ingredients and add natural sweetness. Families mixed the potatoes with flour, sugar, and spices, creating a dense but moist cake that could be sliced and shared in the mornings. It carried the familiar flavor of sweet potatoes while saving on costly ingredients like butter or eggs. For children, sweet potato coffee cakes often felt like a treat, while adults appreciated the practicality of turning a root vegetable into a breakfast staple. The cake was filling and long-lasting, offering energy for long days of labor or activism. Because sweet potatoes were plentiful and inexpensive, this dish became a common sight on tables throughout the civil rights era. It was a symbol of making do, a reminder that families could create joy from what the land provided. Sweet potato coffee cakes carried resilience in every bite, bringing comfort to households even in the hardest years. Brown sugar sweet grits offered a playful twist on the classic savory staple, transforming stone-ground corn into a kid-friendly morning treat. Grits were cooked slowly in milk or water until creamy, then stirred with butter and a generous spoonful of dark brown sugar. The sugar melted into the hot grains, creating a caramel-like sweetness that balanced the subtle corn flavor. Families sometimes added raisins, sliced bananas, or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra indulgence, while others enjoyed the simple pairing of butter and sugar alone. This sweet version of grits became popular in households where children preferred a hint of dessert for breakfast, yet adults appreciated its nourishing heartiness. Brown sugar sweet grits demonstrated how one ingredient could shift from savory to sweet with a few thoughtful touches, proving that a Southern classic could adapt to changing tastes while staying rooted in tradition and comfort. Each steaming bowl brought smiles to the table and warmth that lingered long after the meal. Sweet potato biscuits brought sunshine into the morning, their golden color glowing like joy itself. Grandparents mashed leftover sweet potatoes into flour, sugar, and a bit of lard, turning scraps into softness. The dough came together with care, rolled out and cut by hand before baking to perfection. The smell that drifted from the oven was sweet, nutty, and full of promise. When pulled apart, the biscuits were tender and bright, sweetened naturally by the potato. No jam was needed, just warmth, butter if it was there, and the pride of making something beautiful from leftovers. Kids would eat them fast, the edges still too hot to touch. It was breakfast that felt like celebration, even on the poorest days. Every bite reminded the family that sweetness could grow from hardship, that nothing given by the earth ever went to waste. The color of the biscuits looked like morning sunlight captured in bread form, glowing against the gray of lean years. Every soft bite spoke of love and cleverness, proof that even scraps could bloom into something whole. It was a kind of quiet victory, one baked, not bought, and shared with joy. Wild berry syrup on biscuits was a dish that connected people to the land around them. Families foraged for blackberries, muscadines, or other wild berries when money for store-bought sugar was scarce. The berries were boiled down into thick syrups, which were then poured generously over biscuits hot from the oven. This simple act turned foraging into a memory of sweetness, tying hard times to small joys. Children especially looked forward to berry syrup, savoring the rare taste of fruit in seasons when fresh produce was otherwise out of reach. Adults valued it as a resourceful way of providing variety without spending money. Wild berry syrup on biscuits carried with it the taste of summer, the memory of hands stained purple from picking, and the resilience of communities who found sweetness in the fields and woods. It was survival made delicious, a reminder that even in scarcity, families could still find ways to savor life's small pleasures. Molasses biscuits were one of those breakfasts that felt both humble and rich, depending entirely on the memory you brought to the table. The biscuits themselves were simple, mixed from flour, fat, and whatever milk or water could be spared, but it was the molasses brushed over the top that made them special. The dark sweetness soaked into the warm bread, giving each bite a deep flavor that felt like comfort stretching back generations. Grandparents baked these because molasses was cheap, shelf-stable, and full of the kind of sweetness that made children smile even when times were tight. The smell alone could bring the whole household into the kitchen, filling the air with something warm and grounding. Some families served them with butter, letting it melt into every crack, while others ate them plain, enjoying the caramel-like richness all on its own. These biscuits were not fancy, but they tasted like care, like effort, like mornings where love was baked into every crumb. They were the kind of breakfast that lingered in your memory long after the plate was empty, reminding you of kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything was shared. Leftover cornbread soaked in buttermilk and sweetened with molasses used what remained from Wednesday's supper, transforming it into Thursday morning comfort. Crumbled cornbread filled bowls, then cold buttermilk was poured over until the bread softened and absorbed the tangy liquid. Dark molasses drizzled on top provided sweetness that balanced the buttermilk's sour bite. This breakfast cost virtually nothing since it repurposed yesterday's bread and used staples every household kept. Grandmothers understood that nothing could be wasted when resources were limited. Children initially resisted the unusual combination, but learned to love its tangy sweetness. Adults appreciated how the simple bowl provided energy and nostalgia. The breakfast was especially common where buttermilk came from churning butter and molasses was cheaper than refined sugar. Leftover cornbread and buttermilk proved yesterday's food could become today's treasure. Rice and raisins with butter was the kind of breakfast that felt like a treat, even though it came from the most basic pantry ingredients a household always had on hand. Long before sugary cereal brands took over the shelves, many families started their day with a warm bowl of rice simmered until soft and mixed with sweet raisins that plumped in the heat. A pat of butter melted over the top, coating each grain and adding richness that made the dish feel far more indulgent than its low cost suggested. It was warm, steady, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that felt like a hug before school or chores. Grandparents made it because rice was cheap, raisins lasted forever in a jar, and butter brought everything together in a way that tasted wholesome and familiar. Some added a sprinkle of sugar, others a dash of cinnamon, but most kept it simple, letting the steam rise like a quiet morning ritual. The flavor was gentle, the sweetness mild, and the bowl always seemed to disappear faster than expected. For many families, this dish was tied to winter mornings, cold floors, and the feeling of being cared for before the day even started. Even today, people who grew up with rice and raisins remember the way it filled the house with warmth and made them feel ready for anything. Stewed prunes with grits might sound plain today, but it was a dish that kept households nourished and children strong. Prunes were affordable, dried, and easy to store, making them a reliable sweetener when sugar was limited. Simmered until soft and paired with steaming bowls of grits, they turned into a balanced meal of fiber, sweetness, and filling grains. Large families often leaned on this combination because it could stretch far with little cost. For children, stewed prunes made breakfast feel less plain, while adults valued the strength it provided for long workdays. It was also a dish that traveled through generations, passed down as a memory of lean years and perseverance. Families carried bowls of this simple breakfast before marches, school, and shifts, finding strength in the comfort of familiarity. Stewed prunes with grits became a quiet but powerful dish of the civil rights era, proving that even the humblest meals could carry dignity and hope. Potato hash with onions and peppers was the morning's miracle made from scraps. Grandparents diced leftover boiled potatoes, tossing them into a skillet slick with grease. Onions and peppers joined next, sizzling until soft and golden. The smell rose up, sweet, smoky, and alive. Salt and pepper did the rest, no fancy spices needed. The potatoes crisped at the edges, turning brown and crunchy while the center stayed soft. Served hot with eggs or bread, it filled the room with satisfaction. It was the kind of meal that looked humble but felt whole. You could feed a family on it, stretch it for another day, or serve it proudly on Sunday. Potato hash with onions and peppers was proof that waste didn't exist in a wise kitchen. Every bit could be reborn, every leftover turned into something loved. Sometimes sausage or fatback joined the pan, adding depth and flavor, but the dish never needed more than care. It carried the rhythm of home, the steady scrape of a spatula, the pop of oil, the warmth of shared hunger met with love. Grits with cheese and fried eggs became Thanksgiving morning fuel that prepared families for hours of cooking and welcoming relatives. The grits were cooked low and slow, stirred patiently until creamy, then mixed with sharp cheddar that melted into golden richness. Eggs fried in bacon grease created crispy edges and runny yolks that mixed with the grits like natural gravy. This combination delivered protein and energy in portions generous enough to last through morning chaos. In Black Southern households, grits weren't just breakfast, but foundation food connecting families to their agricultural roots. Grandmothers seasoned them with salt, pepper, and butter. The cheese added calcium while eggs provided protein when meat was saved for dinner. Children scraped their bowls clean. Teenagers ate double portions before being sent on errands. Grits with cheese and fried eggs represented practical wisdom of feeding families well on limited budgets. Egg and rice bowls were one of those fast, dependable breakfasts grandparents made without thinking, because the ingredients were always there and the result was always good. A pot of rice from last night could be rewarmed with a pat of butter, turning it soft and fragrant again. Then came the egg, fried or scrambled, laid gently over the top like a finishing touch. Only older hands knew how to time perfectly. The yolk soaked into the rice or the scrambled bits mixed through, creating a bowl that tasted warm, mild, and deeply comforting. It was cheap, quick, and endlessly reliable, the kind of breakfast that made mornings feel steady. Families loved it because nothing went to waste, because rice could stretch farther than any box of cereal ever could. Egg and rice bowls tasted like routine, like care, like the kind of quiet morning love that came before the sun was fully up. Fried apples and biscuits turned simple fruit into a morning celebration. Apples were sliced thin, tossed into a skillet of melted butter and dusted with sugar until they softened and gleamed like caramel. The smell alone was enough to draw everyone to the table. Served warm beside soft biscuits, the apples made their own syrup, sticky and golden, perfect for spooning or dipping. It was the sort of breakfast that reminded families that sweetness did not have to come from fancy ingredients. It could come from what grew in their own backyard. Sometimes cinnamon or nutmeg found its way into the pan, giving each bite a touch of warmth that lingered. Fried apples and biscuits were especially loved in fall when orchards overflowed and waste was never an option. Grandparents knew how to stretch everything: a few apples, a bit of butter, and the will to make something memorable. This dish was their way of turning simplicity into comfort, of teaching that care was the secret ingredient in any meal. It was nostalgia on a plate, sweet, soft, and glowing, like a memory you could taste. Which forgotten breakfast would you bring back to your morning table? Share your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep waking up these treasured traditions together.